Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. This event is titled Alternatives to Suicide, Shifting Our Language and Approach, and it is hosted by NAMI-NYC, the National Alliance on Mental Illness of New York City, in partnership with the Wildflower Alliance. We're really excited to welcome our speakers, Sarah and Caroline, here tonight. We're really glad that you're all here. I know that there's going to be it's going to take a little while for folks to trickle in. So I'm going to kind of make some announcements on the technical side of things. For anyone who may be using ASL interpretation, our interpreters are ASL interpreter Amanda and ASL interpreter Andrea. We are going to spotlight the active interpreter throughout the presentation, but do feel free to let us know in the chat if you're having trouble, and I'm going to put that message in the chat as well. Para hispanohablantes, por favor, hacen clic en el globo en la parte inferior de la pantalla y selecciona español para oír la interpretación en vivo en español. Si necesitan ayuda, por favor, piden ayuda en el chat y yo les puedo ayudar cuando termino la introducción. Y también pueden tocar donde dice silenciar audio original para solo escuchar al intérprete. We also have automatic closed captions turned on, and if you would, actually, we will have those turned on in a moment. If you would like to view those in a moment, you should be able to click more and then click view live transcript. And I'm going to put the Spanish instructions in the chat as well. As more folks are joining us, hello and welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate your presence. And I think since it is 5 minutes past, I know we still have some folks trickling in, but I am gonna go ahead and just start us off because I am really excited for you all to hear from our speakers. So, hi everyone. For those who have just joined us, welcome to Alternatives to Suicide, Shifting Our Language and Approach, hosted by NAMI-NYC in partnership with the Wildflower Alliance. My name is Clara. I'm going to be moderating to some degree, to the degree that's needed. And I just want to introduce NAMI-NYC very quickly before turning it over to our speakers. As I said, this event is hosted by the National Alliance on Mental Illness of New York City. We are a grassroots mental health organization. Our mission is to provide support, education, and advocacy to all individuals and families impacted by mental illness. And what that means is that we have free virtual classes and support groups for people living with mental health issues and anybody supporting someone living with a mental health issue. All of our classes and groups are facilitated by trained volunteers who themselves are living with a mental health issue or are supporting someone who is, and that's what we mean when we say peer-led. I could definitely say more. Again, want to leave as much time as possible for our speakers. So if you'd like to know more, please go to our website, which is NAMI-NYC.org. I do also want to say very quickly that since we are going to be touching on some difficult topics throughout, I'm sure our speakers are going to emphasize this as well, but please do, if you are overwhelmed or you need to step away from the event, that is totally okay. You know best what you need, and we encourage you to take care of yourself. So with that opening, I'm gonna turn it over to our speakers. And I do also just thank you everyone who's introducing yourself and saying where you're coming from in the chat. That's great to see. Thank you for that. So our speakers are Sarah Davidow. Davidow, thank you. And Caroline Mazel-Carlton. I think you're going to hear so much about them as we kind of go through it, but they are both part of the Wildflower Alliance. Sarah has been part of the Wildflower Alliance since its visioning process, serving as director since it became funded in 2007. Caroline is the director of training for the Wildflower Alliance and has supported the development of the Alternatives to Suicide approach on 4 different continents. And they're both very much working to make these paradigm shifts available more broadly. So I think that's all I'll say, and I'm going to pass it over to Caroline and Sarah to take us away.
Thank you so much, Clara, and thank you to everyone for taking the time to join us tonight. Suicide is such a complex and emotionally charged topic. We're grateful for people coming out. I will say that both Sarah and myself are people who have lived with, grappled with thoughts of suicide, self-injury, suicide attempts in our own lives. We are also people who have lost folks that we love to suicide. Sarah and I are also people who are survivors of institutional trauma when it comes to this topic of suicide. So people who have experienced forced treatment, people who we have experienced police involvement in our lives in ways that have felt scary. When it comes to, our emotional distress. And so all of these experiences are ones that we bring into our work for well over the past 10 to 15 years. We've been a part of this community, the Wildflower Alliance, where we seek to envision new ways to respond to people who are struggling with thoughts of wanting to die, new resources. So we're going to talk about our Alternatives to Suicide groups. We also are home to Massachusetts' first peer respite, a FIA house, recently recognized by the World Health Organization as a best practice. A FIA house is a peer-run alternative to a psychiatric hospital. So this Alternatives to Suicide approach you would see there. But Sarah and I aren't just involved in alternatives to the system. We're very much involved and passionate about systems change. So as we talk about the Alternatives to Suicide approach tonight, we're hoping that everyone, regardless of your role, whether you struggle yourself, whether you work in a psychiatric hospital, in the community, whether you're a family member, we hope that you're going to find something that you can use here, because a lot of these paradigm shifts, I know I have found them useful when doing some of our advocacy in restricted settings. So Wildflower, we apply this approach in a variety of ways. And while we're just really going to be able to scratch the surface, suicide is so complex and each story is different. We also, if there's something here that really interests you and you want to go deeper, we have learning opportunities through the Wildflower Alliance, and we're actually going to be having, starting in January, there'll be an online session of our training Win Conversation, Turns to Suicide, about dialogue and systems change regarding suicide. There's also an online opportunity for people that want training to facilitate Alternatives to Suicide groups. So Welcome, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to really envision a new approach. I know for me, a lot of the times in my darkest moments, I was not truly heard. I wasn't deeply listened to. And it feels good to have this conversation today openly about our responses to suicide and how to move forward. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah now to talk a bit about what is an alternatives to suicide group.
Thanks, Caroline. So we're going to be talking generally about the approach, because at this point we want to be really clear that the alternatives to suicide approach is a thing that's beyond these groups, but it actually started with the groups. And in many ways, I think that's really cool, because it means that the people who have been suicidal, the people that have struggled themselves, are really the ones that led to the approach itself being developed and offered as a broader alternative to QPR and assist in other suicide prevention frameworks that you've probably heard of. So the groups themselves, though, they meet for 90 minutes in non-clinical settings. And the 90 minutes, there's no alternatives to suicide officers that will come around if you are running a shorter or slightly shorter group and give you a ticket or anything. But what we have found, and what we really recommend people do, is that 90 minutes, because it's long enough for people to really get invested in the being together as a group and feel open enough. Sometimes people don't show up the moment they get there open to sharing. This gives them space to get there without being so long that people need breaks and need to go out for cigarettes and so on and so forth. So we have really found over now several years that that really works. So of course, then both facilitators have to identify as navigating suicidal thoughts themselves. And I guess I want to say something a little bit more about that. When we say that, here's a place where we're going to push back on what is often spoken about as the way to regard this. So we actually attended, Caroline and I went to a conference actually in New York. It was a NIAPRS conference several years ago, where someone was doing a presentation on alternatives to suicide who hadn't been through our training. And they really were, well-intended and doing their best with the approach and trying to carry what they understood of it forward. But one of the things they said in that presentation was that, well, the facilitators need to identify, which is correct, but they also need to not have had a suicidal thought for at least a year. And we were like, oh no, we have to fire all of our facilitators if we go by that. And I guess I just want to be clear that one of the places we push back is this really black and white, idea that you're well or you're not well, or that just because you've had experience, it all needs to be in the past, and now you need to be ready to be recovered and share with others how to do that. So we really want to push back on that right from the start. Now, these started in 2008, and they were actually funded through Tapestry Health, which is a harm reduction organization. We're going to get more to that idea of harm reduction, because alternatives to suicide is actually a harm reduction approach, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But we want you to know that although these started in Massachusetts only with Wildflower Alliance, they've now grown beyond Wildflower Alliance in this state to several other states, and in fact to other countries, including Canada and Australia. Australia in particular has done a lot of work with alternatives to suicide. And we've been doing some train the trainer trainings with them so that they can really have it take root and keep up its momentum there. So we want to talk to you, I guess, briefly about the research. Now, people sometimes try to write off approaches if they're not considered evidence-based. And there's a part of my brain that just wants to fight against that, because becoming evidence-based is really rooted in a lot of privilege. You have to have money or university connections or whatever you have in order for people to come in and frankly often manipulate data to prove that you are worth something. And that means that so many things get disregarded, including many of our cultural and ancestral practices of many different groups. And so it's a real issue, but I'll put that aside for the moment, because we also do want people to know there is evidence that supports the alternatives to suicide approach. And there's two things we want to highlight here. There's actually more research that's happened on alternatives to suicide at this point. Some of it, the results are just coming out at this point. But two things we want to highlight here. One, I'm going to go to the second bullet first. That is internal research that we did, which means we basically put out surveys and then we got a lot of data back and we analyzed it. And one of the things we found that we really want people to know is that 90% of the people, it was actually over 90% of the people who responded said the most important thing about alternatives to suicide groups is that they got to speak openly without threat of negative consequences, like loss of liberty, being forced into hospital, that so many people have experienced or seen other people's experience. And we say that because so often when we present about alternatives to suicide, people are always looking for the out. Okay, I hear that you make more space for talking about suicide openly, but what's the limit? When do you actually call a crisis? When do you call 911? And we really want people to understand that there are so many spaces and so many people out there who have that other approach of assessment questions and hospitals and calling 911, et cetera. But we don't have really many spaces where you can just talk and not have people kind of always on alert for what to do. So it's really critical. And we've heard that from the people who've attended. Now, as far as the first piece, that's actually is research that was done in Australia with people who had university connections. And this is really important because what they found was that alternatives to suicide isn't actually that great at getting people to stop thinking about suicide. Now, sometimes people are like, oh, that sounds bad. But the reality is there is no approach out there that has been successful at just getting people to stop having those thoughts in any consistent sort of way. The key here, though, is that it did find that alternatives to suicide was particularly effective at getting people to a point where they had more control over those thoughts. They had a sense of power over those thoughts, and they were learning to read them as signs in some instances. So maybe someone's thought is a sign that a part of their life needs to die or isn't working rather than their body needs to die. And that's essential. That means that people can learn to navigate these thoughts and also have a full life and not feel like a failure if they haven't just been able to make those thoughts go away. So just generally speaking, we're going to go on to the next slide and just give you a little bit more of the what is this about? Where did it come from? So as I already mentioned, this started really with people supporting people, with people who had been suicidal for themselves. And so that's really what it's about. It's designed for and by people who've been suicidal. Now, as Caroline, I think, already mentioned, and as I mentioned, that this came from Tapestry Health in 2008. And it's funny because we say that alternatives to suicide is not suicide prevention per se, and we'll get more into what we mean by that a little bit later. But the reality is it is funded through a suicide prevention grant. Now that's expanded over time, but it is coming through a suicide prevention line of funding for the most part. But as I said, it's at its heart, it's a harm reduction approach. And when I say that, I guess what I want you all to understand is that harm reduction is misunderstood most commonly as only applying to the world of problems with substances and looking like things like clean needles or safer consumption sites. And while those things are very, very important, at its root, a harm reduction approach is about giving up the power to decide what the problem is and what someone needs to do about it. And with alternatives to suicide, that looks like a million different things. You'll hear us share stories that align with that way of thinking over and over, but I'll give you one example right now. So in one of our trainings for alternatives to suicide groups, there was a young man there and he said, you know, I really like this. I like this group, but I also want to say that I don't want to totally lose touch with my pain that brings my suicidal thoughts, because it's also the same pain that drives my music and my art. And that was essential to him. And it was something that was never heard in the conventional system or with conventional suicide prevention approaches. But because this is a harm reduction approach, we get to stick with him and say, yeah, it might not be the suicidal thoughts themselves that are the problem. We'll also talk more about that in a little bit. Maybe that's not the problem. You get to define what the problem is. The problem for him is that they don't get so big that they take over his life, and that he's able to explore that pain and harness that pain and have it drive his art and his music. So hopefully you're hearing the harm reduction in that. So, and as you said, I already have mentioned that it started with groups and has really gone on to this overall approach.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And I just got a DM about captions. I don't actually have control over any of the captions, so I would contact Clara, might be good for that. Sorry about that. So as Sarah said, we've been utilizing this approach in our community since 2008, and we've talked to many people who have benefited from the groups. Most of us are attempt survivors ourselves. So over time, we've really been able to articulate what makes this approach so effective. What are the things that we are moving away from? What are some of the paradigm shifts we're making away from some of the responses in the dominant paradigm and towards something more human, more compassionate, more harm reduction based? So you can see these on the slide. We're going to get through as many of these as we can tonight while still leaving time for questions. We're going to begin first with what the alternatives to suicide approach is an alternative to. So what are some of those paradigm shifts that we make? What are some of the things that we have just learned over the years to just let go of because they're not working well? So maybe you're like me and you have had a conversation in a provider's office, in a mental health professional's office. Maybe you're talking about struggles with housing or struggles with a relationship or struggles in a job. And you're talking about these things going on in your life. And you say something like, sometimes I feel like it's just not worth it. Or sometimes I wish I wasn't here. Or sometimes I wish I was just dead. You make a statement like that during the course of your dialogue. And then all of a sudden, it feels like the conversation shifts. It feels like fear enters the room, rigidity almost. And then what happens is you go from having this complex dialogue about things going on in your life to having someone ask you this list of questions that can feel really detached, really kind of canned. Questions like, are you having thoughts of harming yourself or others? Are you having thoughts of suicide? Do you have means to attempt suicide? Are they lethal means? Probably all of us have heard these types of questions before. And maybe you, like me and others in our community, have felt this real disconnect between these assessment questions versus, the kind of connection and exploration of your problems that would have felt more helpful. So that's the first piece that we're going to look at. Are you having thoughts of suicide? Do you have a plan? Do you have the means to carry it out? Are these responses helpful? I think number one, we want to ask, do these assessment tools, are they actually good at predicting behavior? Does asking these types of closed-ended questions actually help you understand who will live or die by suicide? And what evidence shows is that they actually do not. So we have this guy who's up here at Harvard in Massachusetts. I know this is a lot of words on one slide, but writing here about how over the decades and, with a lot of investment in trying to make these assessment tools, their efficacy is still really poor. The most refined clinical risk assessment tools tend to hover around 50% accuracy in terms of predictive value, which doesn't sound too terribly low until you think about the fact that you could pull a quarter out of your pocket and flip it, and it would be just about as good as a standardized list of questions at predicting who will attempt suicide. And speaking personally as a longtime facilitator of alternatives to suicide groups, sometimes this reliance on these types of questions, this prediction of behavior, can be really frustrating. I will have people come to alternatives to suicide groups who have attempted suicide many times, who have nearly died. And yet, with all the time they've spent in the system, not one person has asked them why they wanted to die by suicide. They spent so much time trying to understand if this person was going to die that they forgot to ask them what was going on, why they wanted to leave this world. And so, using the alternatives to suicide approach, we can almost automatically get much deeper. We can get to the story. We can get to what is driving this person's despair by asking these open-ended questions. And I know for me, really, by the time I was probably 16 years old, I had learned which of these assessment questions that I should answer yes or no to avoid consequences I didn't want. So I will say that likely some of the failures of predictive risk assessments is the fact that people just aren't truthful in them. We feel disconnected from these yes or no behavioral predictive questions. And we tend not to be truthful, especially if we're trying to avoid certain interventions. So this approach is just about letting go at trying to predict the future and taking the time to really understand and listen to another person's suffering. And sometimes I'll share when we talk about this in trainings, I'll have loss survivors get very emotional and they will say, thank you. Thank you so much for showing that even experts, even people who have done this for years, do not have the ability to predict with any kind of accuracy who will live and die by suicide. I have felt my entire life this guilt that I should have known, that I should have seen the signs, that, you know, I should have predicted the future and I wasn't able to. And I love my loved one, and it gives me this freedom to really grieve and let go of this idea that we can, using just a few questions, determine what action people are going to take. Typically, what keeps folks in this world is connection, is conversation. And if we use these questions on the right of the screen, we are going to deepen our connection. We're going to deepen our understanding instead of pushing people away. And I know it can be controversial for people to hear this. Like, I've met some especially recent graduate students that are like, you're going to take my Columbia suicide severity rating scale from my cold, dead hands. I don't want you to take it away from me. I don't want to lose this tool. And sometimes there's a lot of fear about using harm reduction or deep listening approaches to suicide. In fact, a word that I hear a lot, even though I am not a lawyer, I work in the mental health world, is this word liability. People are really spooked by suicide. There's a lot of fear that people will be held responsible, and so change is difficult. But you know, we're also going to bring evidence in here that shows these suits, civil suits where loss survivors, I'm sure there's many other loss survivors in this room, this idea that loss survivors bring all these lawsuits and people are held liable for others' death by suicide. The case law and the legal precedent just really isn't there. In fact, if you talk to attorneys who have taken the time, like Susan Stefan here, to really examine the case law, you will find that the odds of a non-prescribing outpatient clinician, the odds of them being held liable for someone's death by suicide are actually on par with being struck by lightning. It is incredibly, incredibly rare. Also, there is no case law, there's no legal precedent for anyone in a peer support role being involved in one of these lawsuits. And so I think for us, what we'd like to get away from is this focus on fear and liability. I've seen it really cause a lot of harm. One hospital where I was an advocate, there was one tree in the one courtyard, the walled courtyard, that patients had access to. And this tree was beautiful, and a lot of people like enjoyed seeing it throughout the seasons, but they cut that tree down because they're like, oh, a branch could fall and someone could hurt themselves with it. On this same unit, they locked up all of the musical instruments. You know, music is one of these tools people have used for thousands of years to deal with their distress, but they locked up all the instruments because someone could hurt themselves, hang themselves with a guitar string. And I think in a lot of arenas, we've kind of lost our way here. We have to remember that this job, you know, what we're doing, the society we want to create, it's not about protecting corporations. It's about healing people, creating conditions to heal. And for some reason in this area of healthcare, you know, people will let fear of liability really get in the way of progress and compassion and healing. So here on this slide, you can see some of the directions that we move in. Let's take a more common sense approach to some of these fears. And I think a lot of times people have a big fear and they couch it in legal language, but I think it's just a deep emotional fear. Can we begin to explore what's getting in the way for us of talking about suicide? Can we make sure that when people are saying, oh, we have a policy that anyone who talks about suicide must immediately be assessed and committed, or can we make sure that's actually in writing? I know Sarah and I have done a lot of consultation with different organizations that want to use this approach. And sometimes people will say, oh, there's this policy that says this, but really it was just an oral tradition of fear. There was nothing ever written down. And there can be a lot of confusion, for example, about what policies are, what laws say. Mandated reporter, we hear people all the time that think mandated reporter law has something to do with suicide, when really it has to do usually with child abuse, elder abuse. So we just need to remember crisis is not a crime. Suicide is not, having thoughts of suicide isn't a crime. It's time to really get away from some of this legal language, and also remember risk management is not the same thing as healing. Sometimes if we're overly focused on risk management, like that hospital I mentioned, we're actually going to get in the way of people's healing. We're going to get in the way of them finding the tools that they need, finding the connections they need to survive in their community. Yeah, we're asking for more common sense around some of these assumptions. And I'm going to turn it over to Sarah now to talk more about some of these assumptions that might be getting in the way of healing.
Thanks, Caroline. So yeah, so there's this huge assumption that suicide and suicidal thoughts are related to someone being quote unquote mentally ill. And the problem is that it becomes this circular logic that is not, frankly, very well founded in any sort of science or research. I know that when I was first trying to talk about the pain I was in and took this risk of talking about being suicidal, I was told that I was suicidal because I was mentally ill. And then when I asked, how do you know that? How do you know I'm mentally ill? It's, well, because you're suicidal. And that is logic that does not tell us very much at all. And sometimes it would lead to this offshoot of, well, it's because you have this chemical imbalance. And I can't see y'all, so I can't quite do the spiel like I would like to do, but I will say that I assume that many of you, there's over 200 people in this room, I will assume many of you like coffee. Now, if we think about where this chemical imbalance myth basically came from, it relates to this example I'm going to give you, or at least it's an analogy that I think really helps make sense. So let me back up a little bit. The idea of where the chemical imbalance came from is based on how the drugs work. So we have the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors that affect serotonin in the brain. And for some people who've been suicidal and diagnosed with what gets called depression, for some people that psychiatric drug that has the SSRI will help some people for some period of time to some extent. And so people said chemical imbalance, and they did the same thing with the diagnosis of schizophrenia. They took these anti-dopaminergic drugs and gave them to people with this diagnosis and said, well, some people, some of the time, to some extent, seem to do better. So it must be an issue of too much dopamine in the brain, chemical imbalance. But let's take it back to that coffee example. So I assume many of you like coffee, and that presumably means you like the effect of the chemical drug caffeine on your body, or at least you're neutral to it. Now, what I would ask if I could see you all was, now, which one of you think that you are treating a caffeine deficiency in yourself by drinking coffee? And inevitably, usually in a room, there's one or two people who will say like, yep, that's my justification for drinking the coffee. I have a caffeine deficiency that I'm now treating. But when we look at it that way, it's the same logic as they're using to convince us we have chemical imbalances, but it actually doesn't make any sense. If we start to see it doesn't make sense when we take it to the coffee example. We can also use aspirin as perhaps an even easier to understand example, which is just because some people, when they take aspirin, it helps their headache, does not mean the headache was caused by an aspirin deficiency. What drugs do to our body is often pretty divorced, pretty not related to what's actually brought us to that point. And so this weird circular logic, if you weren't already aware, it just doesn't have much of a scientific basis. Now, that's not to say there is no biologic part of this for some people. The problem is we don't really know for most people what's going on, but what we do know is that there is this huge relationship between what's going on in people's environments. That through the adverse childhood experiences study and other studies we've seen over and over again, that there is this really big relationship between what's going on in people's lives, whether or not there's also a biologic component for some people. Now, fortunately, we have places like big groups like the United Nations saying, hey, we've been looking at this wrong. We need to make a paradigm shift. So this is out of a United Nations report in 2017. And what they said basically was that we need to stop focusing so much on chemical imbalances and start focusing on power imbalances. But unfortunately, we're in a system that just isn't really listening to a lot of those messages. They're not listening to our voices. And so we keep getting stuck in places where, even though, as Caroline said, these risk assessments are found scientifically to not be effective, and in some cases to cause harm by shutting people down and making them not want to answer honest questions, we still find ourselves trapped in that system. So what if we could be in a system that actually paid attention to what works? And we're going to offer you this one example. In Norway, in December 2018, the courts ruled that it was against the law to force psychiatric drugs, particularly those psychiatric drugs that are classed as antipsychotics, because the probability scientifically was not high enough that they were going to be effective. So the court said you can't force something that does not have a high enough probability of actually being effective. Oh, what if that was true in this country? We probably wouldn't be doing a lot of the things that we're doing. It would open up so much space and so much financial support for other things. But it's important to bear in mind that suicide is ultimately a political issue. It is a social justice issue. I know sometimes people don't want to go down that path. They don't want to hear that, but it is. And so we'll come back to that point just a little bit more in a moment. But first, you can go to the next slide, Caroline. So as you're thinking about this, here's another slide of just instead of try this. So instead of asking someone, did you take your meds today? Oh my gosh, that's one of the least favorite questions I hear for myself and many people. Just what's going on for you right now? Or someone is saying, hey, this is happening because I'm bipolar. It could just be asking them, you know, well, what does that look like for you? Or saying, I'm here, I'm listening. Even if someone's just crying, I think we have a tendency to want to shut down those emotions that make us uncomfortable and, you know, give someone the tissues, try and get them to stop. But it's actually possible, as you see in this list, to just be with someone and cry. I've actually heard stories from people who said, you know what, I was thinking of going to the hospital because that's what I've been trained to do. But instead I called my friend and we drove around in their car and I just sat in the back and I cried. And that's actually what I needed. And so that can be a huge shift. You see other examples up here. The classic, you have to remember that it's just like diabetes. You know, instead of going down those paths of those things that actually scientifically aren't true, just really honoring what's going on for someone. What's happening right now for you? Are there times when this feels less heavy? Lots of examples. We'll get into more. But back to that idea that this is a social justice issue. So we're going to give you some statistics. We're not going to spend a lot of time on any one of them, but we really just want to emphasize how important it is to realize that suicide is happening within the context of what's going on in this world. And for so many people, for so many marginalized groups, it's a huge issue. So we see, for example, Indigenous people, Native Americans, that the rate of suicide is double the national rate for other folks. And of course, I'm sure you've heard that folks who are LGBTQIA, who are on that spectrum, have much higher rates of suicide and suicide attempts. Trans folks, you'll see here, 40% of trans folks report at least one suicide attempt in this country. When we went to Australia, they said 50%. So I don't know if it's just that their researchers are better, if there's actually a difference. I suspect that we're missing a lot of people when we come up with these statistics. And one thing that is not getting talked about nearly enough is the impact of what's going on in our world on Black and Brown people. So here's a statistic. You see that kids age 5 to 12 who are Black have a suicide rate of 2 times that of white children. Young Black men are also the fastest growing group in terms of suicide rates. And then you'll also see here statistic regarding autistic folks. So I want to be clear that the language here says suicide risk for children diagnosed with autism is as much as 10 times the greater population, or the general population. And why we say it in this way, I just want to give this caveat. Diagnosed with autism is the language of the research, and it's also an indicator for us that we don't know if those people actually felt that they were correctly diagnosed, if they identified as being autistic or so on. A lot of self-advocates will say, however, that this person-first language is problematic, and that's why I want to highlight this point. So we're using it because we actually don't even know if this group was in fact identifying as autistic, or if they simply were given that label and how that impacted them. But just so you know, a lot of self-advocates say that the person first is problematic because it's separating out someone from who they really see themselves as. So the people who identify as autistic tend to really prefer, at least a lot of folks, to just say that they're autistic or an autistic person or what have you. And some of that comes out of the social model of disability that says that, don't make it seem as if this difference in me is a problem or a disease. It's in fact just a different way that I am in the world, and it wouldn't even be a disability if this world was designed with me in mind. So I just want to offer that before we head to the next slide. So you'll also see that social justice is an economic issue. So here you're going to see the impact of this devastating phenomenon of student loans that get so overwhelming. So 1 in 15 have considered suicide over student loans. The higher the minimum wage, the less the suicide rate. I'm not going to read these all to you. You will get these slides at the end, but ultimately, the disparity in income, the impact of huge debt, the risk of being unhoused, all of these things, or actually being unhoused, they have serious impact on people's desire to live. I will say in our peer respite, we've had a few suicide attempts over our 10 years of existence, not a ton of them, but a few. And typically they have been people who are unhoused and don't want to go back out onto the street. We particularly, one of the most memorable incidences, there's only been 4 that I'm recalling, was of a young trans person kicked out of their home and not able to go back and not wanting to go back out on the street. These are huge issues for people. So this next slide is going to talk to you about what I like to call the shocking research that tells us that, hey, in this world, it's not just that trans people are naturally more likely to consider suicide, it's the environment. And if we change the environment to one that recognizes trans kids for who they say they are, recognizes their pronouns and their chosen names, that the suicide rate drops tremendously. Now, the frustrating thing about this is that we didn't actually need official fancy research to tell us that. We knew that in our lives, right? But our systems are such that often people aren't listening until it goes in a research journal. How much better would our world be if that weren't true? But it's helpful to have this research because it is, in fact, the way the world works at the moment.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. And yeah, so I see some people in the chat, talking about, how it can be painful to compare different groups of folks. When we talk about this stuff, what we're really trying to highlight is systemic oppression, that suicide, people talk about, suicide prevention and how it's a mental health issue. But really what we're trying to say is suicide is something that, can every single policy that is made can be one that helps preserve life or one that, struggles, increases people's struggles. I think a lot of the time, what gets called mental illness is just the unbearable burden of some of these systems of oppression, the unbearable burden of poverty, of sexism, racism. So this approach is about calling out some of this, these wider barriers that people face. And how they are continuing to make suicide rates rise. And I know someone mentioned that wealthy people attempt suicide too. A really interesting statistic that is not in our slides here is that countries with a wider wealth gap, or maybe that was on there, countries with a wider wealth gap actually have higher rates of suicide on either side of that gap. So hopefully that makes sense. In countries where there's a lot of inequality, such as the United States, there's higher rates of suicide among the wealthy, among the poor. It's a very fascinating correlation. And one of the things that, the United States has much higher rates of suicide than other nations of similar economic wealth. But what sets the United States apart is the wealth disparity. So sometimes people think, oh, there's higher rates of suicide in the US because of the gaps, because of the inequality, where there's other wealthy nations, but people tend to be more, that wealth tends to be more evenly distributed. So something to think about. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to bring it back now to just experiences I have had in the groups, facilitating alternatives to suicide. One of the things that I hear a lot is people come to group and say, I haven't talked about these thoughts in months. I haven't talked about these thoughts in years. I haven't talked about these thoughts since I called a hotline and then the police showed up to my door. I haven't talked about these thoughts since I was forcibly committed to a treatment facility. I haven't talked about these thoughts since I had to spend a week on a gurney in an ER hallway waiting for a bed and I wasn't allowed to leave. I haven't talked about these thoughts. So I hear this all the time. But what I never hear, not even once, is someone say, I stopped thinking these thoughts when the police showed up my door. I stopped thinking these thoughts when I was forcibly committed. I stopped thinking these thoughts when I experienced this intervention where I lost all my control and agency. No one ever says that they stopped thinking, only that they stopped talking about it. And so someone had asked me in a direct message, how do I feel about the expansion of forced treatment? What I will say is I feel very, very concerned that what it's only going to end up doing is creating more people that are silent, desperate, and alone. Our research on alternatives to suicide shows that people that talk openly about thoughts of suicide and explore them in community are not people that end up dying by suicide. Talking about suicide is often the alternative to suicide. And we're deeply concerned that force and coercion is actually going to backfire and cause more death by suicide. And, you know, some of what concerns us are the many, many research studies that exist showing that acute hospitalization is not an evidence-based practice when it comes to reducing thoughts of suicide. In fact, the best evidence we have is that it actually increases risk. This latest meta-analysis from the Journal of American Medicine showing that that risk can be increased for sometimes up to 2 years. And, you know, as someone with lived experience who talks to a lot of other people who are suicidal, I think being suicidal, it's not just about being in tremendous pain, though that is a part of it. Feeling like you're in pain, at a loss, struggling for resources. Being suicidal is not just about being in pain, it's also feeling like you are completely out of options. So I think there's a real danger when we say to people, the only option for you when you are feeling this way is to go inpatient. The danger is that if that does not work, if that does not resolve a person's pain or struggle, they may think that, well, that was the last house on the block. There's nowhere else for me to go. So when we're using this approach, we don't want to send that message. We want to send the message that the truth, which is there are thousands of alternatives to suicide. I know for me, sometimes my alternatives to suicide has been playing roller derby. Sometimes it has been lying in bed and binge watching the Gilmore Girls. Whatever it is, it's valid. Sometimes it's using a drug is my alternative to suicide. So we just want to be really honest that taking control and sending people to the hospital is not everyone's solution. So in this approach, you can see the paradigm shift that we're making here, asking a person, who else can we reach out to that would feel supportive, instead of assuming that we know. Asking a person, what do you need to get through this? What can I offer? And sometimes it helps to just be really honest. Hopefully we'll get time to talk about this when we touch on our dialogue model. But just being honest with someone, instead of saying like, I need to take over right now, saying, I'm feeling really overwhelmed right now. I want to swoop in and try to fix you and control you, but I don't know if that's the best approach. And ask them, how can I be supportive right now? And I know sometimes people are like, how can I ask a person in distress? But really, this has been highly effective for me in my life. Even when someone has reached out and has said like, I want to die right now, I want to die today. There's value in saying, wow, that's a lot to tell another person. You reached out to me to share this, and those are really hard words to say to another person. I'm wondering, like, is there any hope you had from this conversation? Is there anything you need right now? Anything that motivated you to reach out to another human being instead of just ending your life? Feeling suicidal is so much about feeling powerless. So we don't want our approaches to take more of people's power away. And the last thing I'll say is, I did not include a slide here, but I will mention that when it comes to the risk effect of force, of these acute interventions, the more coerced an intervention is, the more likely it is to increase risk. And this is a phenomenon we also see in the substance use world. Here in Massachusetts, it's been shown people who are forced into substance use treatment are often those that have a higher risk of overdose later on. So we need to think about the long game here, and maintaining a connection instead of just swooping in and taking control of people's lives, and which can backfire and leave people silent.
So this gets back at this idea of what's actually the problem. One of the problems in the world of suicide prevention, and one of the reasons we say alternatives to suicide isn't something we exactly consider suicide prevention, is that the idea is that the suicide is the problem. If you just get people to stop being suicidal, then you've done your job, or at least, get them not to kill themselves, and then you've done your job. In fact, suicide, what we say is it's actually an attempt at a solution. And it might not be a solution we want people to take in many instances, but it is often an attempt at a solution that is really about the problems that you see some examples of down below, like student debt, rigid gender roles, housing struggles. Perhaps someone has come from another country and feels totally disconnected, doesn't know the language, is being harassed by ICE. There's so many different things that go on that drive someone to look for an out, to look for a solution, and that becomes suicide. So I want to share with you a brief story that is going to get at really where alternatives to suicide tries to go, which is that instead of just really focusing on trying to keep someone alive, what alternatives to suicide does is it accepts that suicide is an attempt at a solution and not just the problem. And it really seeks to support someone to find a way to want to live. Now I'm just going to give you this quick story. If you can go to the next slide too, Caroline. So there's this man named David, and I'm going to try and do this quickly because I know we're short on time. Man named David, and he called me on the phone that actually is right off to my left over here. And I had never met him before. And I picked up my phone and I said, hello. And he said, the Department of Mental Health told me to call you because you would have the answers. And I'm like, uh-oh, I don't even know what the question is. How can I possibly have the answer? But, so I told him I was there to listen. And really what he wanted to tell me, he didn't want to ask me a question. He wanted to tell me that he was suicidal and he was going to kill himself. I didn't need to ask him if he had a plan because he was going to tell me what his plan was and when he intended to do it, all of that. And he wanted me to hear him. And he wanted me to accept that. And I got to make a choice in that moment because of where I work and I don't feel under pressure constantly about liability, et cetera. I got to say to him, whatever happens, I'm not going to be the one who's going to call crisis on you or force you to go somewhere. I'm here to listen and you can talk and I'll be here. And he did talk. He talked on the phone, he talked in person, he talked on Facebook. It's just a lot of talking and it was consistently about wanting to die. And I was able to stay with him and not call anyone on him. But the thing was that he still would pick up on the fact that I had this agenda I was carrying. I was trying to figure out, like, what's the thing I can say to make him stop being suicidal? Because that was, still somehow regarding that is the problem. If I could just make him stop being suicidal. And he would get mad at me and he would say, you don't get it. You're not accepting it. I'm going to die and I'm going to kill myself. And you need to accept that. And he was right. And I stepped away. I talked to some coworkers. I needed to figure out how to let go of that agenda. And when I went back, what I said to him was, David, I hear that you're going to die. I hear that you're going to kill yourself. And I do accept that. But I wonder if there's anything you want to do before you die. And there was. He wanted to make this art show with his photography. He had all these photographs he'd been taking over time. He sent me a Dropbox full of them. We talked about which ones would be good in the show, which ones wouldn't be good in the show, which ones he still wanted to go out and take, and how I was going to help him put this show together. And that conversation didn't just last one day. It lasted over the course of a couple of weeks where he went out and took more photographs and went more places. And by the end of all that, he came back and he had reconnected with his own sense of beauty in the world and his own sense of wanting to be alive and stay in it. And when I think about that story, I think, yeah, this is the work we're trying to do. I'm not saying just ask that question and everything will be fixed and it will work for everyone. What I'm saying is we all need to find this way to drop that agenda and just to be present with people, to stop trying to control and instead to support people to create this life that they want to live. And that is harm reduction. And that is the alternatives to suicide approach. So that's really what we're getting to and what we're moving toward. So I think the other idea I want to turn on its head a little bit, and I put another thing turning on its head in the chat. If you didn't see, I have this article out there on Mad in America that talks about instead of assessing people and causing the harm that assessing people who are suicidal causes, how about we start assessing ourselves for whether or not we've done the work we need to do to be ready to support people, because a lot of people haven't done that work, and that was showing up in the chat, so I put it in there. So turning that idea of assessment on the head, I also want to turn this idea of by any means necessary on its head. We talk about this a lot in our longer trainings. What does by any means necessary even mean, and are you ready to do it? And for the most part, people think, well, by any means necessary means locking people up against their will, calling 911, whatever it takes to control someone, at least for as long as you can see them and stop them from killing themselves. But what if by any means necessary actually meant housing, enough food to eat, all the money that we spend on taking people's liberty away and locking them in hospitals that are about containment rather than treatment in most instances? What if we focused it on equity, community supports? What could we change in this world? So I think that we want to talk just a little bit about silence and shame, and then we're going to quickly talk about VCBC and get to some questions. So I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but I think that you all know, from what I'm seeing in the chat, a lot of you know that there's a lot underneath these experiences that people have. And for a lot of people, it's silence and shame, and that they're consistently shown to be factors in studies that drive certain trauma survivors to struggle more. When we can actually give voice to the things that we're ashamed about, that is often a lifting of that shame and creates more space for people to build different lives. And our approaches to suicide, they really hold the key to addressing all these pieces that we're talking about, and rather than replicating them. So I'm going to leave it at that because I really want us to get to the VCBC piece, Caroline.
Great. So we thought about tonight doing a role play of this approach. I don't think we're going to have time for a role play, but if you look for alternatives to suicide, it also helps if you Google Caroline Mazel Carlton or Sarah Davidow. There's YouTube videos out there where we role play what this looks like, and we role play this model VCBC. We've made some of these paradigm shifts about what we're moving away from, but we also think it's nice to have this shared sort of framework for how we respond when someone is feeling suicidal. It has these 4 components, and these are the basic goals. So we begin by showing the person, validating the person, showing them that their fears and concerns make sense and that we're deeply listening. We also lead with our curiosity versus control. We show that person that we care about their individual story, convey that they're the expert on their own experience, and just instead of just treating them like a diagnostic label. We can't truly know what is driving a person to want to end their life until we take the time to really sit and listen. Another thing we're gonna really advocate for is using some of our own vulnerability, not just wearing sort of like a clinical veneer when we talk to people, but sharing some of our own struggles can be really powerful and help people feel like they're not alone and this conversation is an authentic one. And then finally, Alternatives to Suicide is really a community-based approach. So instead of thinking, where can I send this person? Thinking about, what does this person love? Are there any things in the community that still give them a sense of purpose or meaning? And I don't know how much time we'll have to talk about community, but just remember, community can be, music can be a community. Liking a certain TV show, a certain video game. So sometimes folks say, oh, young people that I support, they don't have much community, they don't have much going on. But typically I find if I ask someone, what particular song are you listening to over and over right now? Is there an artist or is there a TikToker that really speaks to what you're feeling right now? We can end up having this deep conversation, both about what this young person is struggling with, but also what sustains them. So just examples of validation, saying things like, that sounds really hard. It makes sense you're feeling this way. I'm sorry that's happened to you. I'm grateful that you've shared this experience with me. And my favorite, that really sucks what you're dealing with. So many times as a person having thoughts of suicide, I've been told this type of thing. Well, get over it. It's not that bad. Those thoughts are selfish. Have you taken your meds? Have you thought about what it would do to your family? These types of invalidating responses, they shut the conversation down. Validating responses convey, I'm listening deeply to you. Our connection is real. You don't have to hold these thoughts inside, and you don't have to feel ashamed about them.
So curiosity is really just so much of what we've already been talking about. What are the questions that are often not getting asked? Even maybe questions like, if someone wants to go, sometimes people have been trained that the only answer is to go to a psychiatric facility, even if it's harming them, even if it's keeping them trapped in a cycle. And so sometimes there's a question that can be asked that's just, what are you hoping to get when you go to the hospital? And that can start a conversation that frankly very rarely gets to happen, because mostly people aren't asking that question about, is the hospital the place you're actually going to get those things? Sometimes it leads to, for example, I have a coworker who said, hey, I will take you to the hospital if that's what you ultimately want to do, but are there other places where you feel strong or at peace? And that person said, yeah, I really like to sit by waterfalls. And she said, I have an app that tells us where the nearest waterfall is. And they went and they sat by the waterfall, and that person moved through that dark place and didn't end up going to the hospital. So there's so much that gets lost when we're just asking the rote questions, or yes and no questions, or questions that shut people down, and so many other questions. You see just some examples on your screen here that can open the door to people making meaning. And you can't underemphasize the power of people being supported to make their own meaning. It can be a tremendous loss of power when people are told what's wrong with them and what to do about it. So there's also questions to avoid. And I think these are not going to come as any big surprise to you. They're going to be questions like, yeah, again, have you taken your meds? Do you have a psychiatrist? Are you in a manic state right now? Things that put labels on, or the shaming questions. Have you ever thought about this, what this would do to your kids? I mean, they're the questions that might come up in our heads. Certainly I've had some of those questions come up in my head when I'm scared, but people are usually already carrying around a lot of shame, and asking those sorts of questions rarely is going to be a helpful way through that dark place for people. So I guess just briefly, we want to talk about what it even means when people say they're suicidal. In our longer trainings, we do these exercises, kind of just asking people to brainstorm, what does it even mean when people say that? But instead, we're going to go to this next page where there's this chart that actually came out of one of my other articles on this topic, and it's going to show you that there's so many meanings. In fact, sometimes when people say they're suicidal, they're saying that because, well, they've been trained to say that by a system that says this is how you get our attention. Sometimes it's because they're unhoused, and this is how they get into a place with a warm bed and food. But if someone's actually thinking of killing themselves, if that's actually what they mean, then there's also so many reasons that you can see in this larger kind of configuration here that is by no means an exhaustive list, but it does give you a lot of examples. It might be that someone's lost someone, they feel unbearable shame, the world is moving too quickly and they just can't keep up. That's one that comes up for me a lot. Sometimes I wake up and I'm like, am I really supposed to just brush my hair and my teeth again and again and just keep doing this and going through these days? I don't know how to keep up. I don't know how to keep doing these things. It feels like too much. So this can be a helpful reference point for folks.
Thank you, Sarah. And I know people mention in the chat, like sometimes it's hard to get people to open up. And that's where a little bit of vulnerability can come in and really help us. I remember when we were in Australia presenting, a man from the Aboriginal community stood and spoke and said, you know, it's totally foreign for me in my culture to share my journey with someone who has shared with me nothing of themselves. And so I think a lot of times I really was not forthcoming with providers because I didn't know who they were. I didn't think that they could understand my problems. And oftentimes they were using language or ideas that didn't resonate with me, that didn't feel authentic or accessible. So when we use I statements, it can really help establish that we. Saying stuff like, this struggle is real. I get so exhausted sometimes myself. Or when I was growing up, I was told you had to be tough and hard all the time. And it sucked having to hold everything inside. When we make statements like this, a person knows they're talking to a real person, that they're not going to be judged. There's a connection that they can latch onto, and we can begin to have a dialogue. I'm someone that in my role, I hear a lot of people that complain about their conventional mental health treatment. And it is I cannot even remember one instance where someone was like, what sucks about my therapist is that she shares too much of herself. What I've mostly heard from people is, I know nothing about my provider. I know she has kids, but she never talks about it. It seems like she's afraid of me. It's really hard to understand like what this person's life has been. And so people say, yeah, they don't really open up. Vulnerability is also a way of showing that we're really subjective in how we view different situations. A lot of times people get scared and they go into control mode or fix it mode. I think what works a lot better for me is just being honest, just saying something true. Sometimes the truth is the thing that causes a breakthrough. Saying, I don't even know what to say right now, but I'm here to listen. Or I would be so sad if I never saw you again. Or I feel scared. I feel worried that I'm going to say the wrong thing. But you're so important to me right now. Sometimes just being honest is what creates this real human connection that we can then, have this difficult, complex conversation around suicide, because our connection is authentic and real. And yeah, like I've had people really connect with me saying this and be like, shit, sometimes I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing. Sometimes I'm so afraid of being judged, and that's what causes me sometimes to want to kill myself. So this type of honesty can just be transformative. And I want to leave us time for questions. So Sarah, if you just want to say a word about community, and then we can take a few. Again, we encourage people to look at some of our upcoming trainings where we'll go much more in depth with some of these responses.
Yeah, so community is really just about deepening one's connection, strengthening their connections. And it can look like so many different things, as you can see on this screen. It doesn't have to be within the conventional mental health system. And, I'm going to really, there's so much more we could say, but I do agree with Caroline. We want to leave it at that.
Thank you both so much. There are, as you both saw, has been a lot of discussion and conversation and questions in the chat. I've been trying to kind of keep track. There were a couple of questions which I think would be great to address around talking with young people. One person asked, like, how could I have this conversation with a child under 10? And someone else asked, do you make any changes to this model when dealing with, teenagers or adolescents? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I would say that we have seen this, I was just having a conversation with a suicidal teenager recently. And I think with children, and Sarah's a parent, so I want to leave space for Sarah too. But I think we forget to validate our kids. we forget that children experience the full range of human emotions, and they just don't have the same experience with regulating it. But those emotions are all there. So when I have someone calling me saying like, I'm devastated because someone blocked me on Instagram, it is not for me to say, you know, who cares? Social media isn't real. It's not a big deal. I would want to say, wow, that sounds really painful. I'm sorry you're going through that. Do you want to talk more about that? It's got to be so hard to lose that connection, and really invite that child into the conversation. I think where we make mistakes is when we treat children like they don't feel things deeply, or they don't have the understanding. So we use this same model with kids, and I think the only thing to remember, and I'll turn over to Sarah, is there is an age where developmentally understanding what death is can be difficult. So if we're talking about someone very, very young, they might not have the understanding yet that if they die, they don't come back. Like, they don't die, go up to heaven and visit their daddy, and then come back like they saw on a cartoon. That, I think that's the place where we really need to consider. And also with kids, the community, they might have a different sense of community than what an adult does. So understanding those generational differences around connection and community.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've had to learn with kids is that, hey, if you're the parent of the kid or a close loved one of the kid, it might not be the best. You might not be the best person as much as you want to be. I know that when my child, who's now 11, started talking about suicide over a year ago, I had to say things to myself like, what would Caroline do? What would Cindy do? What would other people do? Because I just want to contain them, put them in a box and keep them safe. And that's probably not the most helpful thing, right? So that's one of the dynamics that we have to be aware of with kids. It's just this, you know, especially depending on your relationship with children. But the other thing with my child is they do want to talk, and they absolutely want to talk about things without having it reported to other people. It's been such a struggle, particularly because I was going through a divorce through all of this. And, you know, I was getting criticized for not telling their father things. But if I did tell their father things, he'd go back and say, Mom said, and then, you know, it was causing such harm. Kids deserve privacy too. There's a form of oppression that affects kids, and they do deserve that privacy, and to talk to someone trusted without it having be reported. I do find my child likes fewer questions than perhaps, you know, the curiosity piece might be smaller or they'll get very, very annoyed with me. But I think that's, you know, dependent on who you're talking to. With kids, it can be useful, of course, I have found that my child loves to fill out, when their way of speaking is often more through filling out questionnaires rather than like this back and forth in this very adult way. So I think sometimes you might need to play with that. What does it look like? But the principles are still really the same.
That's amazing. Thank you. Can you also talk a little bit about, I think this is a really fantastic question, like if, you know, how to keep that curiosity up if the person is kind of doesn't know, like somebody asked, like, what if somebody can't answer these questions? What if they don't know? What if they don't have, you know, the questions aren't like getting anywhere? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Do you want to go first, Sarah?
It looked like you were about to speak, so go ahead. Go ahead. We're
Okay.
short on time.
Yeah, I mean, what I would just say is, remember, it's the connection that's important. And so sometimes just silence and being with is enough. Suicide is a really solitary act. It's something that's typically done in isolation. So any type of presence or connection, if someone is not really wanting to speak or answer questions, sometimes it's nice to just sit in silence. And remember, this model can also include sharing some of yourself as well. Evidence shows just being with another person, like, can be healing. Our nervous system responds to the nervous system of another. So certainly, yeah, I want to make sure that we're not underestimating the power of connections that aren't even just based on words. And remember that question of like, what do you need right now? Or what do you wish people understood about your situation right now? Or yeah, maybe they don't want to talk about the problems, and you can ask, like, is there any TV show you're binge watching right now? So it's not necessarily about getting somewhere other than just establishing a connection.
Yeah, I don't want to add any more than just to say that sometimes people have a reason not to trust folks, and it takes a while to talk. And this is there, you know, it can look like you're doing nothing, but it can make all the difference in the world to just be willing to be with people and build that trust.
Absolutely. Thank you both. A couple of people also asked, and I think unfortunately this will need to be our last question because we are almost out of time. But we will be sharing, there were many great resources that were shared in the chat. I'm going to be sharing the links to the upcoming trainings as part of the resources email that will go out after this. So we will be, sharing additional resources. The last question was, I really want to know how I can help my community, around some of these issues. Are there local groups I can contribute to, sessions I can lead, policies in motion I can lend a voice to changing? And then somebody else also asked systemically what can be done and what organizations are working on moving the needle towards this shift that you all are kind of outlining.
That's a huge question, and I'll say we're not the experts on New York City, though I know some groups, there's some beginning to have some specific New York City based alternatives to suicide groups. I think I'm just going to say, like, these paradigm shifts are really new. So sometimes starting a conversation based on one or two of them, like sometimes I'll have a provider ask me, like, is your alternatives to suicide approach evidence-based? And what I'll ask is, are you under the impression that some of the approaches you are using are evidence-based? Because actually a lot of them have not been shown to be effective. And starting a conversation about different modalities. We are available to bring training in this approach anywhere. Like, we've been to Australia with it a number of times, and we're happy to bring, the different forms of it wherever people want to facilitate a conversation about these changes and the possibilities.
I will say that there's a particular organization in Vermont that we have worked with that engaged with us and had us do our 16-hour training, not for the groups, but the general approach for everybody, including their crisis clinicians, and also had us work with them to redesign their policies and their responses to everything from self-injury to all sorts of other things. And it's those sorts of organizations that I think are helping to move the needle. Caroline's right. This is a huge question for like the last 2 minutes. And I know we're really over time at this point. But would love to find ways to continue the conversation with all of you.
I'm sorry for, I know it's really hard to answer that quickly. But I just hope that folks take what they've gotten out of listening to Caroline and Sarah, and continue talking, and continue talking with your loved ones, talking with your coworkers, talking with other people in your communities. And we really just appreciate so much all of you being here. And we will continue to share some of these resources. The link, the Wildflower Alliance, I think it's wildfloweralliance.org,
Yes.
has a lot of resources as well. Can you really quickly confirm whether the trainings are free or not? Is that something that you could address?
I'll just say, we're trying to get grant funding for the training. At this point, we don't. So we keep them very low cost, but we do have to pay like our facilitators something. But again, if there's an organization that wants to sponsor a training that could be made available for totally free, we work with that as well. But with Wildflower, when we don't have funding for a training, we do have to rely on some admission costs just so that we can pay like our facilitators.
Right. I will add, though, that if people find, we can't do this for everyone, but for a limited number of people, if you find that you just can't afford what is listed and you email us, we'll generally work with you to get you in there. We just can't have everybody going in for free, especially if they have means to contribute.
Absolutely. And I know a couple of folks asked about, we're interested in continuing to get support after this meeting is over. We do have a support group that is just about to start up. So, if this brought some things up for you, and you want to find a space to get more support, and you don't have that in person right now, please do. You can go to our calendar, which is at NAMI-NYC.org/calendar. I'm hoping that my colleague can get that link into the chat. And the Zoom link, yep, there it is. And if you go there and look under NAMI Connections, the link to join is right there. So you can, continue out. It's for anybody dealing with any kind of mental health issue or struggle. And we hope that you seek out the support that you deserve. And with that, I know we're a little bit over time. I'm sorry that not everyone got to share, but we really, again, just want to continue this conversation, and we want you all to continue being part of that conversation with us. So thank you so much. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, our interpreters, for helping make this accessible. And we appreciate your presence.
Thanks, everyone.